When it comes to Golden Age TV stars, few names stick out like Dick Van Dyke. As a star of his eponymous sitcom, he cultivated a squeaky clean image for himself, one which, as it turned out, became the perfect cover for a life filled with dirty little secrets. This living legend story is a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface. Van Dyke didn't know his true age for many years. The truth finally came to light when he tried to enlist in the US Army, and his mother was forced to come clean about the secret that she'd hidden for so long. Dick Van Dyke's upbringing in a small-town America foreshadowed the role that would one day make him an icon, but it nearly never came to be. A far cry from the sometimes shady realm of Hollywood, Van Dyke grew up wanting to join the ministry. Luckily for fans, all it took was a single drama class in high school to push him toward acting. Soon enough, he got a job at the local radio station, but before he could begin his path to stardom, he had to look death right in the eye. Although Van Dyke's hometown of Danville, Illinois couldn't have been further away from the conflict raging in full force out in Europe, World War II still occupied an outsized part of his teenage mind. He knew that when he turned 18 that he'd be up for the draft, so he came up with a plan. In an attempt to choose his own path, he dropped out of high school. He then attempted to join the US Army forces so that he could become a pilot. However, despite several attempts, the powers that be didn't let Dick Van Dyke enlist. Eventually, after he bulked up before a physical, he made it to the Air Forces, but that didn't mean that he saw combat. Recognizing his talents, the Air Forces made him into a radio announcer and later let him entertain troops stateside. In the end, Van Dyke did manage to evade the front lines, but when World War II ended, he was jobless and without a high school diploma to boot. Returning home to Danville, Dick went with what he knew and went right back to the radio station he'd worked at before World War II. He met his first love, Margie Willett, around this time as well. Van Dyke was just 20, but it was a different time, and he was convinced it was time to grow up and get serious about life. However, that path wouldn't necessarily be an easy one. After a number of failed ventures, Dick Van Dyke met a man who would change his life in more ways than one. Phil Erickson was a pantomime in need of a performing partner. That's a mouthful. And he thought that Dick had potential. They called their act the Merry Mutes. And while it sounds a bit goofy, it became an important stepping stone for Van Dyke, not just professionally, but personally as well. Dick Van Dyke was madly in love with his longtime girlfriend, Margie Willett, but there was one big problem. He was living in Los Angeles and barely making $75 a week. He asked Margie to marry him, and she was sitting at home in Danville waiting for him to take the next step. One day, a bizarre solution presented itself. Dick met the producer of a radio show that profiled couples on their way to the altar. The producer offered to pay for the wedding if Dick and Margie would get married on the show. It wasn't exactly the fairy tale they'd hoped for, but it was something. Dick Van Dyke and his new bride enjoyed a wedding and a luxurious 10-day skiing trip, all on the dime of the bride and groom radio show. But when the honeymoon was over, their dire reality set in. They didn't have enough money for a place of their own, so they moved in with Van Dyke's creative partner, Phil Erickson, and his wife. A few months later, they were finally able to get their own place, but they still struggled. Dick and Margie soon got great news. She was expecting twins, but beneath the surface, not all was well. The bills were mounting, and the Merry Mutes weren't exactly taking off in Hollywood. Dick kept expecting a windfall to save them, but it wasn't coming, and that's when tragedy struck. Margie began having bad cramps, and Dick drove her to the hospital, not even sure that his rickety car would make it. They made it to the hospital, but Margie miscarried, and the misery didn't stop there. Dick left Margie in the hospital to recover and return to their home, and that's when he learned just how life can add insult to injury. Their landlord, who Dick hadn't been able to pay in months, had put all their belongings out on the curb. He packed everything into a car, and when Margie checked out of the hospital, they moved into a dingy hotel room. Things were looking more dire than ever, and they both had a great struggle ahead of them. The Merry Mutes were finding work, but it wasn't enough to keep Dick afloat. At one point, he was left with just $30. But he had an unexpected good luck charm. While Dick slept, Margie took that $30 to the blackjack tables and made enough to get them back in the black. While performing in Miami, Dick got an offer that would take him to the next level. But there was one devastating catch. The club's owner wanted him to ditch his creative partner, Phil Erickson. They were offering him 20 times what he was making. When he mentioned this to his agent, he learned the disturbing truth. Dick Van Dyke didn't realize it, but if he were to accept the offer at the Miami club, he'd be working for the mob. Not only that, but he'd be indebted to them for God knows how long. He quickly and politely backed out of the deal that he thought would be his big break. While that hadn't been it, one was awaiting him right around the corner. The Merry Mutes branched out and ended up on TV, making a variety show for a small station. While Dick had rejected the mob's offer, others kept coming forward with the same suggestion. TV producers wanted Dick, not Phil. There was no easy or graceful way out of the situation, but regardless, Dick tried to make it as painless as possible. Still, Phil was devastated when Dick broke off their creative partnership. Dick began to work on his own show for a New Orleans area TV station, and he and Margie settled there with their growing brood of children. All this led to a real big break when top CBS execs offered him a 7-year contract. Dick and the family packed up and moved just outside of New York City, where he would be working every day. But in many ways, Dick was completely unprepared for both his work at CBS and for the life in the big city. Dick Van Dyke found success as one of the hosts on CBS's morning show, only for the brass to take him off that program. They shuffled him from show to show, including a very brief stint on the first iteration of The Price is Right. He began to worry that something was wrong. And he was right. One of the CBS execs didn't like him and didn't think he had it. All of a sudden, the security of that 7-year contract seemed to dissipate before his eyes. Despite his best efforts, the writing was on the wall for Dick Van Dyke. He couldn't bring the bosses at CBS around, and they let him go after 3 years. Once again, he had to worry about keeping a roof over his and Margie's heads. Plus, this time around, they had 3 kids to worry about. The pressure was on, and Dick had to find some way to deal with it. Dick faced losing everything he'd worked so hard for, and the tension took him down a dark path. He began to drink, and it all began innocently enough. After all, when he first arrived in New York City, he'd learned the hard way at a business lunch that he didn't have the same constitution as his martini-swilling bosses. But now, he began to catch up to them, and drinking became a regular part of his life. It wasn't a problem at first, but as we'll see, it came back to bite him. TV wasn't working out for Dick Van Dyke, so he landed a few Broadway auditions. It seemed like he was giving up on the medium that he loved, but it would wind up being the thing that brought him back to it. After one show, he landed the lead in a new production named Bye Bye Birdie. Dick not only originated the role of Albert Peterson in the musical, but he won the Best Feature Actor Tony for his performance. He'd finally made a name for himself, and now it was time to capitalize on it. At the time, future showbiz legend Carl Reiner was struggling with a sitcom pilot he'd written. He wanted to star in it. After all, it was based on his experiences as a comedy writer, but no one wanted him in the role. He needed a lead, and hearing about the success of Bye Bye Birdie, he went down to Broadway to check it out. When Reiner saw Van Dyke, he knew he had the right guy, and when Van Dyke read the script, he knew he had the chance of a lifetime. While still starring as Albert Peterson, Dick Van Dyke began working on Reiner's new sitcom. At first, filming the pilot and then making the first season. There wasn't even time to breathe between the end of his tenure on Broadway and the debut of the show. But perhaps the biggest coup of all was the name of the show. Despite the Tony win, Dick Van Dyke was by no means a household name. Reiner wanted to change that, for Dick and for the show. That's when he came up with an unconventional plan. He wanted to call it The Dick Van Dyke Show. Everyone was confused. No one knew who he was, or what the show was, but Reiner pressed for it, and it worked. The Dick Van Dyke Show debuted in October of 1961. While it wasn't an immediate hit, it made a lasting impression. In its first season, Carl Reiner won an Emmy for writing, but even that triumph couldn't save the show from the precarious position it was in. CBS was on the verge of canceling it when it won an unexpected ally. Procter & Gamble threatened to pull advertising unless CBS renewed it. It was a gamble, and it paid off. In its second season, The Dick Van Dyke Show went from being ranked 80 in the ratings to making it to the top 10, coming in at 9. The next season, it peaked at 3. Dick got an Emmy that year, as did his co-star, an actress just starting out by the name of Mary Tyler Moore. Van Dyke later admitted to having a huge crush on the younger actress, but he didn't act on it. However, as we'll see, his marriage had much worse storms to weather than just a crush. Van Dyke's TV success created a demand for him on the big screen, and with the news that Bye Bye Birdie was being adapted into a movie, it seemed like an easy choice for his film debut. Unfortunately, he was in for a disappointing surprise. The adaptation significantly lessened his character's role and shifted the focus to another character. Van Dyke was a good sport about it, and it paved the way for better things. The year after Bye Bye Birdie, Van Dyke appeared in the dual roles of Bert the Chimney Sweep and Mr. Dawes Sr. in Mary Poppins. While the film was a hit, there was some backlash over Dick's performance. People think of Bert's Cockney accent as one of the worst movie accents of all time. Actors actually study it to learn how not to put on a new dialect. Well, you can't win them all, a lesson that Van Dyke learned multiple times throughout his life. Despite the nitpicking about Mary Poppins, Dick Van Dyke greatly enjoyed his experience on the film. This was in sharp contrast to his experience on What a Way to Go. As production wore on, the lighthearted film that he'd signed up for had turned into a dark comedy. After the film was finished, he vowed that he only wanted to appear on projects that he could show his 4 children. This vow contributed to his wholesome reputation, but behind the scenes, it was an image he didn't always live up to. Dick Van Dyke tried hard to keep up the appearances of the family man that he'd created for himself on and off the screen. He and Margie avoided Hollywood parties, with the exception of the Emmys. Margie begrudgingly attended each year, only to be mistreated by paparazzi and the TV brass who jock-eyed for her husband's attention. Even while filming his namesake sitcom, which kept a demanding schedule, Dick taught at Sunday school. But this combination of professional and personal demands created immense pressure on both of them, and it would eventually burst. When Dick Van Dyke went to film The Art of Love in Paris, he brought Margie with him, hoping to get some quality time in. Instead, they faced a complete nightmare. The tabloids printed stories claiming that he was having an affair with his co-star, Angie Dickinson, and that he was fighting with another male co-star over her. It was his first brush with Hollywood scandal, but it wouldn't be the last. As production began for the 5th season of The Dick Van Dyke Show, its star was as energetic and dedicated as ever. There was just one problem. Carl Reiner, the show's creator, had only ever planned to make 5 seasons. There was no changing his mind either. Van Dyke's dream of a steady, secure job that left him fulfilled was dead in the water. Despite all his success, the same panic he used to feel when he had few prospects ahead and even fewer dollars returned. Margie's apathy toward the Hollywood lifestyle had been growing exponentially. Without a sitcom set to return to every day, Dick took the opportunity to move the family to their ranch in Arizona full-time. But not long after, he made a discovery that seemed too good to be true. A soundstage meant for film and TV productions had popped up just a few miles down the road. He could even commute on his mini bike there. It was time for Van Dyke to return to the small screen. That soundstage became a major factor in the creation of Van Dyke's next project, the creatively named The New Dick Van Dyke Show. Despite the dud title, the show managed to gain an audience and it ran for 3 seasons, cementing its star status as a TV icon. But if Van Dyke thought removing Hollywood from the equation would solve all his problems, he was unfortunately dead wrong. Dick Van Dyke seemed to have it all: a happy family, creative freedom, stardom, his own show, and hey, he didn't even have to commute. But beneath the surface, he was hiding a dark secret. To cope with the pressures that keeping up such a perfect life created, he turned to the bottle. It began innocently enough, but by 1972, it was becoming a serious problem, and he knew he had to do something about it. The solution seemed simple enough. Dick opened up the yellow pages, found a listing for a hospital that offered treatment for alcoholics, and called them up. They told him to come in right away, and he did. When he arrived at the hospital, the staff sent Van Dyke, the wholesome sitcom dad, straight to the psych ward, where he weathered the storm beside alcoholics and drug addicts going through serious withdrawal. On his last day at the hospital, Van Dyke thought that Margie was coming to pick him up. Instead, he faced a devastating surprise. When she came to the hospital that day, it was so that she could check herself in. She'd been addicted to pills, and Dick hadn't even noticed. She took over his room at the hospital and began her own journey of sobriety. But it wouldn't be easy. Over the next few weeks, Dick acted the part of the supportive partner as Margie went through her own stint in rehab. When the dust settled, they were both sober for the first time in years. It should have been a great return to form for the couple, but instead they found that they didn't necessarily like what they saw. And there were more complications than that to throw into the mix. The new Dick Van Dyke Show was about to start filming its 3rd season, and the network execs were tired of dealing with the production in Arizona when everything else was made in New York or Los Angeles. They insisted that the show be moved to Hollywood, so Dick went along with it, leaving Margie and the kids in Arizona. For the first time in his life, Dick Van Dyke was living alone. At the same time, he was fighting to stay sober. After a few months of this lonely existence, he relapsed. As regret set in, he confessed what had happened to Margie. In 1974, Van Dyke signed on to do a TV movie called The Morning After about an alcoholic PR writer. It was a grittier role than he was used to, but he obviously related to the story. And around the time of the film's release, he made a stunning decision. Van Dyke decided to reveal that he had a drinking problem. While this doesn't seem so scandalous today, at the time, it was a real shocker. Few, if any, stars confess to having personal problems, let alone suffering from alcoholism. But with his squeaky clean image on the line, Van Dyke had to worry about the backlash. Both Van Dyke's admission and the movie itself, which lacked the happy ending his other projects did, went against everything that he'd done before. He was pleasantly surprised to find that the film did well and the fans were supportive. But when all was said and done, this seeming breakthrough did little to help him with his day-to-day struggles. Call it a midlife crisis or empty nest syndrome, but whatever it was, both Dick and Margie were really going through it. The high school sweethearts struggled to find common ground as they entered the third decade of their marriage. They had to face the dark truth. Each attempt to bring them back together failed. On top of it, Dick was grappling with decisions about what to do with his career. He needed to talk it out with a neutral party. Hollywood stars have all kinds of people to help them work through their career issues, from agents to managers, but this time around, Dick found himself relying on his agent's secretary, Michelle Triola. She was an experienced industry veteran and a straight shooter, just what he needed. But there was a lot more to Michelle than just admin work and good advice. During this time, Michelle was involved in an infamous lawsuit against actor Lee Marvin, who she'd been romantically involved with for many years. She'd given up her career for him on the promise that he'd support her. When he then dumped her, she sued for palimony, despite the fact that they've never been married. This lawsuit left her splashed across the tabloid pages. And thanks to Dick Van Dyke, it wouldn't be the last time she appeared there. Dick Van Dyke was torn between two worlds. His Hollywood achievements were innumerable, and Margie didn't see why he had to keep struggling to prove himself to various TV execs. Why not retire? On the other side, Van Dyke loved performing and didn't want to stop. And in that corner of the ring was Michelle. They could talk for hours about the business or creative life, and she understood the allure of Hollywood. That's when things began to get out of hand. One night, Dick Van Dyke found himself sitting in the corner of a dark restaurant with Michelle, sipping on a martini. He'd been stuck for so long, and now it was time to do something about it. Dick Van Dyke went to Margie, his high school sweetheart, the mother of his children, and the wife of 3 decades, and made a heartbreaking confession. He told her that he had strong feelings for another woman. Margie was stunned, but after a gut-wrenching few weeks of talks, they came to an odd conclusion. They wouldn't divorce, but they would go on living separate lives from that moment. Finally, Dick was free to begin a relationship with Michelle, but before long, her scandalous past came back to haunt them. After many years and many appeals, she won a judgment for roughly $100,000 against her ex, Lee Marvin. But then he appealed, and she lost. She was incredibly upset, and Dick wanted to give her the money. However, this offer had a disturbing side effect. The tabloids caught on to Dick's relationship with Michelle, and his gift of $100,000 to her became the final straw for Margie. When she protested, Dick laid down the law and told her that it was his money and his choice. The argument ultimately compelled the estranged couple to finally get a divorce. Despite the moment of tension, it wound up being an amicable split. Ironically enough, Dick ended up taking some of Margie's better advice and took fewer projects throughout the 80s, more content to spend his time sailing with Michelle. They talked about getting married, but they were also perfectly happy as they were. Unfortunately, a brutal tragedy broke through their happy idyll. In 1987, Dick's first grandchild, Jessica, took some baby aspirin while dealing with a bout of chickenpox at 13. Unfortunately, the medicine triggered a rare and undetected disorder within her body. The medication caused an infection, and she died tragically and suddenly at the age of 13. Dick Van Dyke had finally figured out that if he wanted to keep going, he needed to take care of himself. He'd quit drinking and smoking, but Michelle hadn't taken the same precautions. She had a heart attack in 1989, but during her recovery, Dick noticed a peculiar and ominous side effect. When Michelle asked him what a remote control did, he knew something was terribly wrong. Within hours, Michelle lost the ability to think clearly or express herself. He rushed her to the hospital, where they found she'd suffered from a stroke. Luckily, she was fine, but it was a wake-up call for both of them. Though Dick Van Dyke had finally kicked his drinking problem, he was still an addict of another kind. He was a workaholic. For years, he tried and failed to retire. In the middle of it all, he even starred in the series Diagnosis Murder for 8 years. In recent years, his inability to stop working has continued to plague him, even in the face of immense tragedy. Though Dick Van Dyke has kept his energy and work level at an age where most would long retire, life threw him a true 1-2 punch. In 2008, his first wife, Margie Willett, lost her battle with pancreatic cancer. It was a brutal hit, and it didn't end there. In 2009, Dick's longtime partner, Michelle Triola, received a diagnosis of lung cancer. In her final days, after she slipped into a coma, he sang to her every day until she finally passed. Unfortunately, while caring for his sick wife and then grieving her, he was also dealing with health issues of his own. In 2013, he revealed that he'd been suffering from a mysterious ailment for years, and the symptoms were brutal. He'd get debilitating, pounding headaches whenever he laid down, which made sleeping impossible. Although he went through scores of tests, doctors struggled to diagnose him. Left looking for answers, he came up with one of his own. He suspects that titanium dental implants may have caused the illness. At least there was a bright spot in it all. Dick Van Dyke deeply mourned the loss of his longtime partner Michelle, but he was eventually able to at least mend part of his broken heart when he met makeup artist Arlene Silver. The pair began as friends, but it eventually deepened into a romance, one which raised eyebrows. There was a 46-year age gap between the pair, but both friends and family approve. They tied the knot in 2012 when she was 40 and he was 86, and they're still going strong. Dick Van Dyke is still kicking at 96, or at least we think he's 96. His actual birthday has been a thing of mystery, and it all goes back to a family secret. His parents lied to him about his birthday for all his childhood. The truth came out when he thought he was 17 and worried about being drafted into the army. His mom then revealed the truth. He was already 18. She'd said he'd been born premature, but something about her story didn't check out. When Dick confronted his grandmother about his mother's secret, she asked him exactly what his mother said. When he recounted the story about being born premature, she scoffed and revealed the truth. His parents had conceived him out of wedlock, which at the time, in a small town, was seriously scandalous. They later moved his birthday forward to conceal the shameful truth. Well, that concludes the fascinating life and career of the legendary Dick Van Dyke, a true American treasure. If you've enjoyed these stories, don't forget to show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Stay tuned because we'll be back with more incredible narratives soon. Thanks for joining us today, and until next time.